a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times, and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
When Mel Gibson brought up the Ethiopian Bible in a recent interview, he didn't call it a secret. He called it something Western Christians simply never learned about, a version of Scripture with incredible detail that most of the world has never opened. That single comment was enough to send people searching. Within days, forums and comment sections filled with the same question: what exactly is the Ethiopian Bible, and why isn't it the one most of us grew up with? The honest answer is stranger than most of the rumors, because it doesn't require a conspiracy. It requires geography, politics, and about 17 centuries of a country that simply never got the memo the rest of Christendom eventually agreed on. Here is the part that surprises people first. The Bible most Protestants know has 66 books. The Catholic Bible has 73. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church recognizes 81. That is not a rounding error or a translation quirk. It is the largest biblical canon in continuous use anywhere in Christianity, and it has been that way for so long that Ethiopian Christians have never known anything else. Among the additional texts are the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, along with expanded material connected to Jeremiah. Several works known as the Maccabean books, sometimes called the Ethiopian Maccabees, though they are entirely different stories from the Maccabees known in the West, and a body of church order literature, including the Synodos and the Ethiopic Didascalia. None of this is hidden. Scholars have studied it for well over a century. What's different now is that a famous director said the word Ethiopian Bible out loud, and a lot of people heard it for the first time. So why does Ethiopia have a different Bible at all? The answer starts in the 4th century, when Christianity became the state religion of the Kingdom of Aksum, modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, making it one of the very first nations on earth to adopt Christianity officially, alongside Armenia. That's not a footnote. That's centuries before most of Europe had converted. But Ethiopia's Christianity didn't grow up inside the Roman world. It developed at the edge of it, connected by trade routes across the Red Sea rather than by direct political control from Rome or Constantinople. When the great councils of the early church met to hammer out doctrine and, eventually, to settle which books counted as scripture, Ethiopia wasn't sitting at that table in the way the Latin and Greek churches were. Its church grew through its own scholars, its own monastic communities, and its own ancient liturgical language, Guiz, a language that is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox worship today, much the way Latin persisted in Catholic liturgy long after most people stopped speaking it day to day. This is where the story usually gets exaggerated into something it isn't. It's tempting to imagine a secret meeting in Rome where officials decided which books were too dangerous and ordered the rest destroyed. That's a dramatic image, but it's not how canon formation actually worked, and serious historians are clear about that. The process was slow, messy, and regional. Different Christian communities across Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, North Africa, and Europe used different collections of texts for generations. Some communities read Enoch as scripture. Others read the Shepherd of Hermas. Others debated whether Revelation belonged in the canon at all. A debate that went on for centuries in the Greek-speaking church. Slowly, through countless local decisions, copying practices, and eventually broader councils, a rough consensus formed in the Latin and Greek-speaking world around the books most Christians recognize today. Ethiopia simply wasn't part of that consensus-building process, and because it was never absorbed into the Roman imperial church, nothing forced it to abandon the wider collection of texts its own scholars had already been using. Later, Ethiopia's long resistance to European colonization. It's one of only 2 African nations never colonized by a European power, meant that its religious institutions were never dismantled or forcibly reorganized along Western lines the way so many other regions were. Its monasteries kept functioning. Its scribes kept copying manuscripts by hand, inscriptoria carved into cliffside churches and hidden in highland forests for century after century. That continuity is the real story here, and it's arguably more remarkable than any hidden prophecy narrative could be. It's a living, unbroken thread of textual tradition that survived precisely because it was never interrupted. Even the number 81 has a history worth understanding, because it isn't as tidy as it sounds. Ethiopian tradition has long held that its Bible contains 81 canonical books, and that figure appears repeatedly in church documents going back centuries. But researchers who've actually tried to compile a single definitive list of all 81 have run into something interesting. The medieval Ethiopian law code known as the Fetha states outright that the canon contains 81 books, then only names 73 of them. Later Ethiopian scholars had to work out which additional texts belonged in the remaining slots, and different manuscripts and different regions of the country reached slightly different conclusions. Some editions reach 81 by splitting books like Samuel or Kings into separate volumes, rather than by adding entirely new texts. Others include the broader canon material outright. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church itself has never published one single, universally agreed list that resolves every discrepancy. That's not a scandal. Plenty of ancient traditions carry small inconsistencies like this. But it does mean the 81 books framing is best understood as a long-standing counting tradition rather than a fixed, itemized checklist that's been sitting untouched since antiquity. Now about that book of Enoch, since it's the text people always ask about first. It's an ancient Jewish apocalyptic work, written well before Jesus, full of visions of angels, cosmic judgment, and the origins of evil in the world. It was clearly known to early Christians. The New Testament book of Jude directly references it, which tells us it circulated widely enough in the first century that a New Testament author could quote it and expect readers to recognize it. Over time, most of the church stopped treating it as scripture, while Ethiopia kept it. That's a genuinely fascinating piece of religious history. But it is a secret blueprint for the future, and scholars who actually work on Enochic literature are consistent on this point. It deepens our understanding of the religious world Jesus was born into, not a hidden biography of Jesus himself, and not a coded prophecy about our era specifically. That distinction matters because it's exactly where a lot of viral retellings go off the rails. There is no verified record of Jesus delivering a secret 40-day sermon about 4 stages of a final age or 7 seals of the heart that was later scrubbed from the record at the Council of Nicaea. Those aren't phrases that appear in the actual Ethiopian broader canon, and Nicaea in 325 AD wasn't even a meeting about the biblical canon in the first place. It was convened primarily to settle a theological dispute about the nature of Christ, the controversy known as Arianism. The canon of Scripture wasn't formally addressed at Nicaea at all. That process played out separately, gradually, over the following decades and centuries, through regional councils and long-standing church practice. Attaching a dramatic secret canon story to Nicaea makes for a good hook, but it collapses the moment you check the actual history. What is real, and honestly more interesting than the invented version, is how genuinely different the Ethiopian tradition's apocalyptic literature is in tone. Ethiopian Christian writing in this tradition, particularly the material found in Enoch and Jubilees, does spend real energy on cosmic order, moral corruption, angelic rebellion, and divine judgment. That's true. Ethiopian theology has always taken the spiritual and cosmic dimensions of Scripture seriously in a way that can feel unfamiliar to Christians raised on a narrower canon. But different emphasis is not the same thing as a suppressed alternate prophecy engineered to hide the truth from the masses. One is history. The other is a story built to keep you watching. It's also worth understanding how these texts made their way to Western attention at all, because that part of the story has nothing to do with suppression and everything to do with simple logistics. For most of European history, Guizi was a language almost no Western scholar could read. The texts weren't locked in a vault. They were sitting in monastery libraries in the Ethiopian highlands, openly used in worship, just written in a language that happened to be inaccessible to outsiders. That began to change in the 18th century, when European travelers and later missionaries and scholars started bringing manuscripts back and working on translations. The Book of Enoch specifically became widely known in the West after the Scottish traveler James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in the 1770s with copies of the text, which scholars then spent decades translating into English, French, and German. By the 20th century, Enoch, Jubilees, and other Ethiopic texts were standard reading in university departments studying Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. None of this required a whistleblower or a leak. It required people learning a difficult ancient language, which is a much slower and much less cinematic process. But it's exactly how the real discovery happened. So where does that leave Gibson's actual comment? He's not a theologian, and he's never claimed to be one. What he is, by his own account over the years, is someone who spent enormous amounts of time and money immersed in early Christian history and languages while making the Passion of the Christ, and who has continued that interest since. When he references the Ethiopian Bible containing incredible detail, the most reasonable reading, the one that fits what he's actually said publicly, is that he encountered this broader, older canon during his research and found it striking, the same way plenty of scholars, seminary students, and curious readers have found it striking for decades. That's a legitimate reaction. Discovering that Christianity has always been more textually diverse than a single Sunday school version suggests is genuinely eye-opening the first time you learn it. It doesn't need embellishment to be interesting. It's also worth saying plainly, there's no verified evidence that Gibson has made the specific claims about hidden end-times prophecy, a final witness generation, or a secretly transmitted teaching about a coming final empire that have circulated attached to his name. Those narratives appear to have been built around his general comments and then expanded, quote by invented quote, into something far more sensational than what he actually said. That pattern, a public figure makes a brief, genuine comment, and then an entire mythology gets constructed around it, is common online, and it's worth being skeptical of any version of this story that hands you exact words in quotation marks without a clear, checkable source. None of that makes the real history less compelling. If anything, it's more compelling because it's true. Here is a Christian tradition older than most nations currently on a map, preserved by monks in mountain monasteries who had no way of knowing that a global audience would eventually be curious about their work. Ethiopia's church didn't need a conspiracy to end up with a different Bible. It needed independence, distance from imperial politics, an unbroken monastic culture, and enough isolation that its manuscripts were never forcibly replaced. That's not suppression. That's survival. And it's a very different, and in some ways more moving, story than the one about buried prophecies. Scholars like Ephraim Isaac, one of the most respected translators of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, have spent careers making exactly this case, that the Ethiopian canon isn't a rival Bible plotting against the Western one. It's a living record of how diverse early Christianity actually was before anyone had the authority or the desire to force uniformity onto it. Understanding that diversity doesn't threaten anyone's faith. It just means the story of how the Bible came to be is bigger, slower, and more human than most of us were ever taught. So the next time you see a headline promising a hidden prophecy Rome supposedly erased, it's worth asking a simple question. Is this describing something you can actually go read in a real manuscript, translated by real scholars, in a real library? In the case of the Ethiopian Bible, the answer is yes. You absolutely can go read Enoch, Jubilees, and the Maccabean books in published translations today. What you'll find in them isn't a countdown to the end of the world. It's a window into how the earliest Christians actually thought, prayed, and imagined the universe, preserved against considerable odds, in the highlands of a country that simply refused to let it disappear. That's the real